Biography, Plato, the philosopher who built Western thought, documentary. Plato was one of the most influential philosophers in Western history. Born around 328 BCE in Athens, Greece, he was a student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle, forming a foundational trio in the history of philosophy. Coming from a noble and aristocratic family, Plato founded the Academy of Athens, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. His writings, mostly in the form of dialogues, explore deep questions about justice, politics, ethics, knowledge, love, and the nature of reality. Plato is best known for his theory of forms, which argues that the material world is only a shadow of a higher eternal reality composed of perfect, unchanging ideas. This concept shaped centuries of philosophical and theological thought. In his famous work, The Republic, Plato outlines his vision of an ideal society governed by philosopher kings. His ideas continue to influence modern philosophy, political theory, education, and science, making him a central figure in the intellectual tradition of the Western world.
Thank you for watching. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Please subscribe. Thank you.
Birth and aristocratic roots. 427 BCE, Athens, Greece. Plato was born in 427 BCE in Athens, during a time of both cultural brilliance and deep political instability. His birth name was Aristocrates, but he would later become known as Plato, possibly derived from the Greek word platos, meaning broad, referring either to his physical build or to the breadth of his thought. He was born into a family of high status and ancient lineage, among the most respected aristocratic households of the Athenian nobility. His father, Ariston, claimed descent from Codrus, the legendary last king of Athens, while his mother, Perictione, belonged to a noble family linked to the great lawmaker Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece. This noble ancestry placed Plato in a social class that was highly educated and deeply involved in the civic life of the city. The family home was likely located near the deme of Calidus, just outside the city walls of classical Athens. This environment exposed Plato from an early age to the most important political, philosophical, and cultural movements of his time. His relatives included politicians, poets, and military leaders, many of whom would have had direct influence on the young boy's perception of governance and public duty. The Athens into which Plato was born was both a democracy and a cultural superpower. During the late 5th century BCE, it had become the intellectual capital of the Greek world. It boasted an advanced political system, a rich tradition in drama, the arts, and philosophy, and it was home to some of the most iconic thinkers, artists, and statesmen of the classical world. However, this prosperity coexisted with rising internal tensions and external conflicts, particularly the Peloponnesian War against Sparta. The ideological tension between oligarchy and democracy was central to Athenian life during Plato's formative years. His mother's family leaned toward the aristocratic and oligarchic side, as evidenced by her relations with figures like Critias and Charmides, 2 of the 30 tyrants who briefly seized control of Athens after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. These associations would haunt Plato later in life and influence his deep skepticism toward democracy as practiced in his era. Despite the political unrest, the elite class in which Plato was raised offered him access to the highest levels of education, literature, and philosophy available in Athens. His early years would have been filled with private tutors, recitations of Homeric epics, exposure to traditional mythology, and the intellectual discourse of his family's extensive social network. These aristocratic roots did not make Plato complacent or purely conservative, however. Rather, they gave him a unique vantage point, one from which he could see both the power and failure of Athenian leadership, both the beauty and corruption embedded in his society. In the United States today, this would be akin to a child being born into a family tied to the Founding Fathers, surrounded by legacy, privilege, and political weight. Imagine growing up in a home where names like Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton weren't just historical figures, but family acquaintances. In such a context, ideas of justice, leadership, and moral duty would not just be taught, but lived and questioned generation after generation. Plato inherited this legacy and then reshaped it entirely.
Childhood and upbringing. Plato's early childhood unfolded within the refined and intellectually charged environment of Athenian aristocracy. As a boy born into one of the city's oldest and most politically connected families, his education began at home and followed the traditional path prescribed for young males of elite status. In classical Athens, this meant rigorous training in both mind and body, what the Greeks saw as a holistic preparation for a life of public service, leadership, and intellectual excellence. From a young age, Plato was introduced to musike, a term that encompassed far more than music as we know it today. It included poetry, rhythm, singing, and the learning of epic literature, particularly Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These texts were considered moral and philosophical guides as much as stories, and they served as central tools for educating the youth in virtue and civic responsibility. Plato would have memorized long passages, recited them before his tutors, and internalized lessons about heroism, fate, justice, and the gods. Alongside this literary education, Plato received instruction in gymnastike, the physical training essential for developing strength, discipline, and aesthetic harmony. Athenian boys trained in wrestling, discus, running, and javelin. This was not only about preparing for war or competition, but was viewed as a way of cultivating the soul through care of the body. Plato, according to later accounts, excelled in physical fitness. He was said to be broad-shouldered and athletic, and his nickname, Plato, may have originated from the Greek platos, meaning broad. Rhetoric and dialectic were also key components of his education. By adolescence, Plato would have encountered lessons in grammar, logic, and public speaking, crucial skills for anyone aspiring to political leadership in democratic Athens. His ability to structure argument, respond to challenges, and persuade an audience began developing during this time and would later define the power of his dialogues. Though Plato would eventually grow critical of sophists, teachers who charged fees to train students in persuasive speech, he nonetheless benefited from their methods in his formative years. But his education was not confined to technical learning. Being raised in an aristocratic household, Plato would have participated in dinner symposia, gatherings where influential men discussed philosophy, politics, and poetry while reclining on couches. These conversations exposed him to diverse schools of thought and taught him to listen, challenge, and synthesize ideas. He would have heard firsthand debates on the meaning of justice, the function of the state, and the nature of virtue. These experiences laid the groundwork for the philosophical voice he would later develop. The cultural environment of Athens was as formative as the curriculum. The city was a living classroom. During the 5th century BCE, the Acropolis was adorned with new temples and sculptures. The tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides were performed regularly at the theater of Dionysus. Philosophers, poets, and artists gathered in the agora. For a child like Plato, this wasn't background, it was immersion. Each street, statue, and discussion reinforced the ideal of paideia, the Greek concept of holistic education and cultural refinement. But even in these early years, Plato was likely aware of the deep fractures within Athenian society. The tensions between democracy and oligarchy, the political instability caused by the Peloponnesian War, and the contradictions between Athens' ideals and its actions were visible to any educated observer. His relatives Critias and Charmides, whom he would later criticize, were influential members of the 30 Tyrants, a short-lived and brutal oligarchic regime. Their role in suppressing democracy in 404 BCE would leave a bitter imprint on Plato's political thought, even if these events took place after his formal education. For an American comparison, one might imagine the child of a U.S. senator or Supreme Court justice being raised in Washington, D.C., surrounded by the machinery of law and power, with access to exclusive institutions and steeped in national debates from an early age.
The child would grow up not only educated, but acutely aware of the ideals versus the realities of leadership. This was Plato's childhood, a blend of privilege, cultural saturation, and increasing exposure to political contradiction. Even though we lack specific anecdotes from Plato's youth, the structure of Athenian society and the known traditions of aristocratic education allow us to reconstruct his upbringing with a high degree of confidence. He was not merely taught to recite poems or throw a discus. He was shaped to think, to lead, and to seek wisdom in all things. These early foundations, both their strengths and their flaws, would later emerge in his writings, especially in his concern for balance between the rational, spirited, and appetitive parts of the soul. As he matured, these experiences fused into a deep conviction. The existing political structures of Athens were inadequate. They failed to educate leaders in the pursuit of truth. They confused popularity with wisdom, and they allowed emotion and appetite to dominate reason. This conviction would soon grow even stronger once he met the man who would change the course of his life, Socrates.
3. The encounter with Socrates. The defining intellectual event of Plato's life occurred when he met Socrates, the enigmatic Athenian thinker whose radical method of inquiry challenged conventional wisdom and disrupted public complacency. Though the exact date of their first meeting is unknown, most scholars place it during Plato's late teens or early 20s, around the final years of the Peloponnesian War. At that time, Socrates was already a well-known, if controversial, figure in Athens, easily recognizable for his ungroomed appearance, penetrating questions, and unyielding pursuit of truth. For Plato, whose education had been steeped in Homeric ideals and aristocratic values, the encounter with Socrates was a profound turning point. Here was a man who asked questions not to impress or to gain followers, but to uncover inconsistencies in people's beliefs, forcing them to re-examine their deepest assumptions. Socrates was not a formal teacher. He charged no tuition, offered no lectures, and produced no written works. But his influence as a thinker was undeniable. He roamed the agora, engaging statesmen, poets, craftsmen, and generals in spontaneous dialectical exchanges that often left his interlocutors confused or angry. Plato was captivated. Unlike the sophists, who trained students for courtroom success or political gain, Socrates seemed to operate on a different plane. He sought not victory in argument, but clarity of thought and moral integrity. The Socratic method, questioning, refuting, redefining, became the intellectual foundation upon which Plato would build his entire philosophical system. In Socrates, he found both a mentor and a model, someone who valued the examined life above all else, who was unafraid to confront power, and who believed that knowledge and virtue were inseparable. The historical Socrates remains elusive, but in Plato's dialogues, he becomes a literary and philosophical anchor. Whether discussing justice in the Republic, love in the Symposium, or the nature of the soul in Phaedo, Socrates appears not as a lecturer, but as a relentless questioner. Through him, Plato presents philosophy as a living practice, interactive, humble, and deeply human. Their relationship, though not documented in detail through personal letters or third-party biographies, can be glimpsed through Plato's reverence. He rarely, if ever, speaks in his own voice in his dialogues. Instead, he allows Socrates to carry the arguments. In Apology, which recounts Socrates' trial, Plato's emotional and intellectual debt is palpable. He casts his teacher as a moral martyr, calm, eloquent, and unbending in the face of state-sanctioned injustice. For Plato, Socrates was not just a great mind, he was the ideal philosopher, one who lived and died according to his principles. The attraction to Socrates was not merely intellectual, it was also ethical and spiritual. In a city where rhetoric was often used for manipulation and power, Socrates stood apart as someone who embodied the virtues he explored.
Plato, raised among elites who often spoke of justice while practicing self-interest, found in Socrates a form of integrity that transcended class, tradition, and politics. But this admiration came with a cost. Plato's association with Socrates placed him at odds with many of his own peers and family members, especially those aligned with the political establishment. As Athens shifted between democracy and oligarchy, Socrates' method of relentless questioning was viewed by many as destabilizing. He was accused of corrupting the youth and undermining the gods of the city, charges that would eventually lead to his trial and death. But Plato was undeterred. The more he observed Socrates, the more he became convinced that the true role of the philosopher was not to flatter or conform, but to challenge. Socrates did not teach facts or doctrines. He taught how to think, how to doubt, and how to strive for truth, even when it was uncomfortable. For Plato, this was a revelation. It was the birth of his own philosophical calling. To understand this moment from a contemporary American perspective, one might compare it to a gifted law student or political science major at an Ivy League school encountering a radical thinker who rejects conventional career paths in favor of street-level activism and intellectual honesty. That thinker doesn't seek fame or wealth, but clarity and virtue. For the student, such a figure might appear foolish to outsiders, but to them, it would be revolutionary. That is how Socrates appeared to Plato. Their relationship redefined Plato's goals. He no longer saw a future in public office or military command, both typical paths for young Athenian elites. Instead, he envisioned a life devoted to philosophical inquiry, one in which dialogue and reason would replace propaganda and violence. The memory of Socrates would become his compass, and in time, his mission would be to preserve and elevate his mentor's legacy, not just through writing, but by founding an institution dedicated to the life of the mind. Thus, the encounter with Socrates was not just a friendship, it was a philosophical awakening. And for Plato, it marked the beginning of a lifelong journey to define, defend, and deepen the principles his teacher had lived and died for.
4. The Peloponnesian War and Athenian decline. Plato's young adulthood unfolded during one of the most transformative and tragic chapters in the history of Athens, the Peloponnesian War. This prolonged conflict, which lasted from 431 BCE to 404 BCE, was fought between Athens and Sparta, two leading Greek city-states with opposing political systems, cultures, and military strengths. For the people of Athens, and particularly for Plato and his generation, the war marked the end of their city's golden age and the beginning of a deep political, moral, and cultural crisis. As a teenager and young man, Plato witnessed firsthand how the war eroded the civic ideals and intellectual vitality that had once defined Athenian identity. The democratic experiment, once hailed as a model of citizen participation and rational deliberation, began to collapse under the weight of corruption, fear, and populism. Political leaders like Cleon and Alcibiades capitalized on public emotions and shifting allegiances, often promoting expedient policies that ultimately led to disaster. The conflict deeply divided the Athenian public. The early stages of the war were marked by naval victories and confidence, but prolonged sieges, plagues, and internal power struggles soon sapped the strength and spirit of the city. Plato would have observed how public discourse deteriorated, how rhetoric replaced wisdom, and how temporary gain became more valued than long-term justice. The war did not just claim lives and property, it claimed ideals. And for a young man deeply shaped by Socratic thought, this decline had a profound impact. In many ways, the Peloponnesian War was a crucible that forged Plato's political philosophy. He came to see firsthand how democracy, when corrupted by demagoguery and ignorance, could devolve into chaos.
The death tolls were not abstract for him. He lived through the devastating plague that struck Athens in 430 BCE, killing tens of thousands, including the great statesman Pericles. The loss of leaders with moral vision and strategic prudence left Athens vulnerable to opportunists and ideologues. By the time the war ended in 404 BCE, Athens was broken. Sparta emerged victorious, and the democratic government was overthrown, replaced by the oligarchic regime of the 30 tyrants. Among this brutal group were two of Plato's own relatives, Critias and Charmides, whose reign was marked by executions, exiles, and property confiscations. For Plato, this was more than a political disappointment. It was a personal and philosophical reckoning. These were men from his own class, raised with the same education and traditions, yet they had chosen tyranny over virtue. The trauma of the war and its aftermath shook Plato's confidence in the political models available to his city. Neither democracy nor oligarchy, as practiced in his lifetime, had achieved justice or stability. Instead, both had contributed to a cycle of violence and moral collapse. This disillusionment drove Plato away from any direct political engagement, at least for the time being, and pushed him toward a deeper philosophical investigation into what an ideal society should look like. In the American context, this experience might be likened to a young intellectual living through the Vietnam War or the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, moments when national ideals come into conflict with political reality. Witnessing the failure of institutions, the erosion of trust in leadership, and the public susceptibility to fear and manipulation can profoundly shape one's worldview. For Plato, the Peloponnesian War served as both historical experience and philosophical data. It was not just something he lived through, it became something he analyzed for the rest of his life. Importantly, this period also reinforced the value of Socrates' teachings. While politicians shifted their allegiances and philosophers like the sophists adapted to changing winds, Socrates remained steadfast. His refusal to compromise his beliefs, especially when Athens was most unstable, became a beacon for Plato. The war may have destroyed the physical city and corrupted its institutions, but it also clarified the kind of intellectual and moral integrity that would guide Plato's later writings. By his early 20s, Plato had turned away from traditional ambitions. The war had shown him what happens when power is not grounded in wisdom. He began to imagine a society where rulers would be chosen not for their popularity or military prowess, but for their capacity to reason, to educate, and to pursue the common good. These ideas would take form later in works like The Republic, but their emotional and historical roots can be traced directly to the devastation of the Peloponnesian War. The war ended, but its consequences endured. Athens would never again regain its former dominance, and its political life would remain unstable. But for Plato, the crisis also brought clarity. He would not seek justice in the messy arena of everyday politics. Instead, he would retreat into thought, dialogue, and eventually institutional reform, planting the seeds for a new vision of society, one based not on force or faction, but on reason and virtue.
5. Socrates' trial and execution, 399 BCE. The trial and execution of Socrates in 399 BCE marked the most pivotal moment in Plato's life, searing into his memory the moral failure of the Athenian state and the vulnerability of philosophy in the face of political ignorance. Plato was around 28 years old at the time, old enough to fully grasp the significance of the charges, the injustice of the proceedings, and the devastating impact of the outcome. It was a moment of public betrayal and philosophical martyrdom that would shape his entire intellectual career. Socrates was charged with 2 crimes,
impiety, failing to recognize the gods acknowledged by the state, and corrupting the youth of Athens. These accusations masked a deeper political anxiety. Socrates' method of questioning had made him many enemies, especially among the powerful. His influence on younger generations, including figures like Alcibiades and Critias, both of whom were associated with political upheaval, made him a convenient scapegoat for a city desperate to reassert control after the trauma of war and tyranny. Plato attended the trial, and his dialogue Apology provides a vivid, though philosophically stylized, account of Socrates' defense. In it, Socrates refuses to beg for mercy, refuses to pander to the jury, and refuses to abandon his mission to seek truth. He famously claims that the unexamined life is not worth living, a line that Plato would later elevate to one of the cornerstones of Western philosophy. The trial ended with a guilty verdict and a sentence of death by hemlock. Socrates could have proposed exile or remained silent to avoid condemnation, but he chose to stand by his principles. For Plato, the trial was not just a miscarriage of justice. It was a revelation of democracy's darkest potential, when the will of the majority, guided by fear and ignorance, becomes indistinguishable from mob rule. Plato had grown up believing in the power of dialogue, of civic participation, of rational debate. But the death of Socrates shattered any lingering faith he had in the existing political structure. Athens had killed its wisest man, not for any violent act, but for asking too many questions. It was a condemnation not only of Socrates, but of the very practice of philosophy. This trauma would haunt Plato for the rest of his life. In many of his dialogues, especially Crito and Phaedo, he explores the themes of justice, duty, and death through Socrates' final hours. In Crito, Socrates refuses an offer to escape from prison, arguing that one must never return injustice with injustice. In Phaedo, he discusses the immortality of the soul and drinks the poison calmly, surrounded by friends. Plato was likely not present at the actual moment of death. He mentions being ill, but the event left a permanent mark on his worldview. Socrates' execution drove Plato to a series of conclusions that would shape his future work. First, that philosophy must be protected from political corruption. Second, that the existing forms of government, whether democratic, oligarchic, or tyrannical, were deeply flawed. And third, that the ideal state must be governed by those who truly understand justice, not those who chase public approval or personal gain. From an American perspective, the trial might be compared to moments in U.S. history when public fear and political instability led to grave miscarriages of justice. The Red Scare, McCarthyism, or the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. In each case, reason and principle were sacrificed for perceived safety or revenge. Socrates' death, for Plato, was the Athenian version of such a crisis, when a civilization turns against its own conscience. Yet rather than turn to despair or exile, Plato transformed the experience into philosophical fuel. He devoted his life to ensuring that Socrates' voice would never be silenced. His dialogues preserved Socratic questioning, elevated its method, and expanded its reach. And in doing so, Plato redefined philosophy not just as a discipline of logic or ethics, but as a way of living, a courageous commitment to truth in the face of ignorance and power. The state executed the man, but through Plato, Socrates became immortal. And the lessons drawn from that trial would echo throughout Western civilization for millennia.
6. The Journey of Exile and Exploration, 399 to 387 BCE. In the immediate aftermath of Socrates' execution, Plato left Athens. This decision was not simply a personal reaction to grief. It was a calculated step toward philosophical and intellectual development. He had just witnessed the city he loved condemn its most virtuous citizen to death. In that environment, philosophy was not safe, and reform from within seemed impossible. Plato's departure marked the beginning of a transformative journey across the Mediterranean, spanning more than a decade, during which he encountered new cultures, thinkers, and ideas that would profoundly shape his metaphysical and ethical philosophy. His first stop was likely Megara, a nearby city where many of Socrates' followers, including Euclid of Megara, not to be confused with the mathematician Euclid of Alexandria, had taken refuge. In Megara, Plato was among fellow intellectuals who continued Socratic dialogue away from the hostile environment of Athens. This period allowed him to begin digesting the trauma of the trial and to consider how Socrates' legacy might be preserved through written philosophy rather than public disputation. But Plato did not remain in Megara long. Seeking broader wisdom, he began a journey that took him across the ancient intellectual world. He is believed to have traveled to Egypt, a land renowned for its ancient knowledge, priestly traditions, and complex metaphysics. Egyptian religion and cosmology, with its emphasis on order, the afterlife, and the divine structure of the universe, likely influenced Plato's later ideas about eternal forms and the soul's immortality. Egyptian priests, regarded as scholars and scientists of their time, introduced Plato to new systems of thought that blended spiritual belief with geometric precision. From Egypt, he may have traveled to Cyrene in North Africa, home to a school of mathematics and medicine. The city was known for its scientific inquiry, and here Plato likely encountered the fusion of mathematical reasoning with natural philosophy. It was also during this phase of his journey that he is believed to have interacted with followers of Pythagoras, particularly in southern Italy. Plato's encounter with the Pythagorean tradition was one of the most pivotal episodes of this period. Pythagoreanism, though rooted in mathematics, was deeply metaphysical. It treated numbers not merely as tools for measurement, but as expressions of cosmic order. Harmony, proportion, and geometry were seen as the keys to understanding both the material and spiritual worlds. This worldview deeply resonated with Plato's evolving ideas. The notion that reality was governed by intelligible structures beyond sensory experience provided the groundwork for his later theory of forms. In the Pythagorean communities of Magna Graecia, particularly in places like Tarentum and Croton, Plato would have seen firsthand how philosophy could guide not only personal conduct, but communal life. These semi-monastic groups followed strict ethical codes, studied mathematics and music, and believed that the soul could be purified through knowledge and virtue. The concept of the tripartite soul, which would become central in the Republic, echoes this influence. The rational part must govern the spirited and appetitive elements in harmony, much like mathematical balance in a musical scale. Plato's journeys were not just scholarly, they were deeply philosophical. He was testing ideas across cultural and geographic boundaries, searching for universal truths that transcended Athenian politics. He was also refining his view of the philosopher, not merely as a rhetorician or sophist, but as a seeker of eternal knowledge, capable of guiding society toward justice and order. Throughout his journey, Plato would have observed many systems of governance and religion. These experiences convinced him that while customs varied, the human desire for truth, justice, and order was universal. What differed was the degree to which societies supported rational inquiry and moral education. Most did not. Even Egypt and the Pythagorean communities, for all their wisdom, lacked what Plato would eventually try to create in Athens, a formal institution devoted to philosophical training and the pursuit of truth above all else. In contemporary American terms, Plato's journey might be compared to that of a disillusioned scholar leaving Washington, D.C. after a national scandal or crisis, then traveling through Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, studying in religious seminaries, science institutes, and think tanks. He was not abandoning his country. He was preparing to return with better tools to improve it. By the time he made his way back to Athens in the mid-380s BCE, Plato had changed. He had seen more of the world than most of his peers, absorbed multiple traditions, and developed the early scaffolding of what would become one of the most original philosophical systems in history. He returned not as an apprentice, but as a visionary. What he had learned on the road would soon take form in the academy, a new kind of institution and the birthplace of Western higher education.
7. The first visit to Syracuse, Sicily. Around 388 BCE, shortly after returning to Athens, Plato embarked on one of the most ambitious and perilous ventures of his life, a journey to Syracuse, a powerful Greek city-state on the island of Sicily. This expedition was motivated not by curiosity or personal gain, but by philosophical idealism. Plato had begun to imagine that philosophy could be applied directly to political life, that with the right guidance, a ruler could be educated in virtue, justice, and reason, becoming a philosopher king in the mold he would later describe in the Republic. The city of Syracuse, with its wealth, influence, and youthful prince Dionysius I, seemed like the perfect testing ground for that vision. Plato's invitation came through Dion, a member of the Syracusan nobility and brother-in-law to Dionysius I. Dion was a learned and ambitious man, and he had become interested in Plato's ideas about governance and ethics. Believing that Sicily could benefit from a philosopher's wisdom, Dion persuaded Plato to come and attempt to reform the court of Dionysius from the inside. At this time, Dionysius I ruled Syracuse as a tyrant, an absolute monarch in the Greek sense of the term, with broad power but little philosophical inclination. Plato, perhaps still inspired by Socrates' legacy and emboldened by his travels, agreed to the proposal. The voyage to Sicily was long and difficult, but it held the promise of transforming political theory into political reality. Upon arrival, however, Plato was confronted by the harsh complexities of court life. Dionysius I was not a receptive student. He was paranoid, autocratic, and suspicious of outsiders, particularly intellectuals who questioned the basis of his power. Though Plato attempted to introduce ideas about virtue, self-restraint, and the philosophical life, he quickly realized that the court was not the place for Socratic dialogue. The atmosphere was filled with flattery, intrigue, and fear. Dionysius, concerned that Plato was turning Dion into a political rival or undermining his authority, began to resent the philosopher's presence. The optimism that had fueled Plato's journey gave way to deep disillusionment. Eventually, the situation deteriorated to the point where Plato's safety was at risk. According to later accounts, Dionysius I either forced him to leave the court or, in a more hostile version of the story, had him sold into slavery and deported from Sicily. Plato was rescued by Anaxagoras, a wealthy admirer from Cyrene, who paid his ransom and secured his release. This dramatic episode became one of the most painful experiences of Plato's life, but it also taught him an enduring lesson about the limits of political idealism. What began as a bold philosophical experiment ended in failure and humiliation. The ruler had not been transformed. Power had not been tamed by reason. Plato came to see that without a deep and lifelong education in virtue and logic, no leader could truly embody the qualities of a philosopher king. Political reform required more than speeches. It required a cultural and institutional revolution, starting with education. The failure in Syracuse was not the end of Plato's engagement with politics, but it fundamentally reshaped how he would approach it going forward. From an American viewpoint, this episode might be likened to a highly educated reformer or advisor accepting a position in a foreign dictatorship with hopes of implementing democratic reforms, only to discover that corruption and fear dominate the system. Despite idealistic intentions, the reformer is rejected, threatened, and exiled. The experience becomes a cautionary tale about the risks of engaging with power without fully understanding its dynamics. Still, Plato did not abandon the possibility of merging philosophy with governance. He simply came to believe that such a project could only succeed if the leaders were trained from youth in logic, ethics, mathematics, and dialectic. The philosophical life could not be grafted onto a corrupt soul. It had to be nurtured from the beginning.
This conviction would become the core rationale for founding the academy upon his return to Athens. Although the first visit to Syracuse ended in disappointment, it provided essential material for Plato's political writings. It exposed the gap between philosophical ideals and real-world power, and reinforced his belief that rulers must be philosophers, not in name or pretense, but in actual intellect and moral capacity. And it marked a turning point in Plato's career, from the young philosopher who tried to change a tyrant's heart to the institutional founder who sought to educate a new generation of rational leaders.
8. Return to Athens and founding of the academy. C. 387 BCE. After the failure in Syracuse, Plato returned to Athens with a renewed sense of purpose. Disillusioned by the corruption and unpredictability of political life, he concluded that genuine societal reform could only begin with education. It was not enough to advise rulers or participate in politics directly. Instead, Plato would lay the foundations for a new kind of institution, one that trained minds in philosophy, mathematics, and dialectic, and prepared future leaders to govern through wisdom, not ambition. Around 387 BCE, he founded the Academy, an institution that would become the cornerstone of Western intellectual history. The Academy was located just outside the walls of Athens, in a grove dedicated to the hero Academus, from which the school would take its name. The site was serene, surrounded by olive trees and open fields, far removed from the noise and distractions of the political center. But this was no leisurely retreat. The Academy was a serious center of inquiry, structured around rigorous intellectual activity and collaborative exploration of truth. It is considered by many historians to be the first university in Western civilization. The school was not governed by formal admission requirements or standardized curricula. Instead, it operated as a community of learners united by their commitment to philosophical inquiry. Students, known as mathetai, engaged in dialogues, mathematical studies, astronomical observations, and political theory. The daily practice of dialectic, structured, logical conversation was central to the Academy's method. Rather than being told what to think, students were taught how to think. This emphasis on reasoned argument and critical questioning mirrored Socratic principles, which Plato had now formalized into an enduring educational system. Plato personally led the Academy for over 4 decades, mentoring students, guiding discussions, and producing some of his most influential works during this time. His presence at the school was not authoritarian. He facilitated rather than dictated, encouraging debate and dissent. Though Plato's own philosophy dominated the culture of the Academy, the environment was one of intellectual freedom, where ideas were tested against reason, not accepted by fiat. Among the most famous students to emerge from the Academy was Aristotle, who joined the school around 367 BCE at the age of 17 and remained there for 20 years. Though he would later diverge sharply from Plato's metaphysics and epistemology, Aristotle's training at the Academy laid the groundwork for his own philosophical system, which would eventually rival Plato's in influence. The Academy was also home to mathematicians like Eudoxus of Cnidus, who advanced the study of geometry and astronomical models, and Speusippus, Plato's own nephew, who would eventually succeed him as the head of the school. Together, they formed a multidisciplinary institution that blurred the boundaries between philosophy, science, mathematics, and ethics. Plato's Academy was not simply a school, it was a blueprint for a better society. He believed that by cultivating rational, virtuous citizens, the Academy could sow the seeds of a just political order. Students were encouraged to consider not just abstract theories, but practical questions about governance, law, and civic responsibility. In this way, the Academy functioned both as a haven for scholars and as an incubator for future leaders, albeit leaders who would be prepared philosophically, not just politically. The Academy's impact cannot be overstated. It remained active for nearly 900 years, surviving through Hellenistic times and into the Roman Empire, until it was finally closed by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in 529 CE. Its model inspired countless later institutions, including modern universities in Europe and America.
The very idea that society benefits when individuals are trained in logic, ethics, and science can be traced directly to Plato's foundational work at the Academy. In the context of American culture, the Academy can be likened to Harvard, Princeton, or Yale in their earliest days, not merely as centers for knowledge, but as institutions with a mission to shape public virtue and leadership. Plato was not just teaching philosophy, he was cultivating a civic elite equipped with the tools of reason and moral clarity. The decision to establish the Academy marked Plato's final departure from direct political engagement. He no longer believed that philosophers could walk into a royal court and change policy. Instead, he believed they had to reshape the very fabric of culture through education, through example, and through generations of slow, thoughtful influence. By training minds rather than attempting to command thrones, Plato created a system that would outlive him by centuries and transform the world's understanding of truth, knowledge, and justice.
9. Writings and Dialogues, Literary Philosophy. Plato's literary output is one of the most remarkable bodies of philosophical writing in history, not only for its depth of insight, but also for its unique form. Rather than writing systematic treatises or manuals, Plato composed dialogues, philosophical conversations involving real historical figures, often with Socrates as the central voice. This approach allowed him to dramatize the process of inquiry, to showcase the tension between competing ideas, and to guide the reader through layers of thought in an accessible narrative structure. His dialogues have endured not only as philosophical documents, but as works of literature, elegant, dramatic, and profoundly human. Plato's choice of the dialogue form was a continuation of Socrates' legacy. Socrates had never written anything himself. His philosophy lived through conversation. Plato honored this tradition by putting philosophy into motion, through speech, through questioning, and through unresolved tension. Many of his dialogues end not with a clear conclusion, but with a sense of philosophical ambiguity, reflecting the complexity of truth and the continuing journey toward wisdom. His dialogues are generally divided into 3 periods: early, middle, and late, though exact dating remains debated among scholars. The early dialogues, such as Apology, Crito, Euthyphro, and Protagoras, are the most faithful to the historical Socrates. These works emphasize ethical inquiry, the nature of piety, justice, courage, and the examined life. In Apology, Plato recounts Socrates' defense speech at his trial, portraying him as a fearless seeker of truth who challenges the complacency of Athens. In Crito, Socrates refuses to escape prison, choosing instead to honor the rule of law, even a flawed one. These early dialogues highlight Plato's grief, reverence, and moral outrage following Socrates' execution. The middle dialogues represent Plato's philosophical maturity and the development of his most famous theories. In the Republic, he constructs a comprehensive vision of an ideal society grounded in justice, rational governance, and the rule of philosopher kings. It introduces the theory of forms, the idea that beyond the sensory world exists a realm of perfect, eternal forms, such as the form of justice or the form of beauty, which gives structure and meaning to all that exists. The Republic also contains the allegory of the cave, perhaps the most famous metaphor in Western thought, depicting human ignorance and the painful but necessary journey toward enlightenment. Other middle dialogues, such as Symposium and Phaedrus, explore the nature of love, particularly eros, and its relationship to beauty, immortality, and the soul's ascent toward the divine. These works blend myth, psychology, and metaphysics into a poetic philosophical framework. Love, for Plato, is not merely an emotion, but a motivating force that draws the soul toward higher truths. His late dialogues, including Timaeus, Critias, Parmenides, and Laws, are more abstract and often more difficult. In these works, Plato tests the limits of his earlier ideas. In Parmenides, for instance, he critiques his own theory of forms through a devastating logical examination. Timaeus presents a cosmological account of the universe's creation by a divine craftsman, demiurge, who imposes mathematical order on chaotic matter. In Laws, His final and longest dialogue, Plato shifts away from the idealism of the Republic, offering instead a more pragmatic framework for a real-world constitution governed by rule of law and philosophical religion. Throughout all these texts, certain core themes persist. Justice, not simply legal fairness, but a harmony of the soul and society where each part functions in its proper role. The soul. Plato divides the soul into three parts: rational, spirited, and appetitive, mirroring the structure of his ideal city. Knowledge and perception. True knowledge for Plato is recollection of the eternal forms. Sensory perception can mislead, only reason reveals the real. Education. Education is not filling a vessel, but turning the soul toward the light. The role of the teacher is to guide, not to dictate. Love and beauty. Eros is the soul's longing for transcendence, for union with the eternal. Politics and philosophy. Only when guided by wisdom can rulers create a just society. Philosophy and political power must be united. Plato's use of myth, such as the myth of in the Republic, or the charioteer allegory in Phaedrus, allowed him to express truths that rational analysis could not fully capture. He believed that philosophy needed both reason and imagination, logos and mythos, to engage the whole soul. His language is lucid, rhythmic, and precise. He was not simply a philosopher, but a master of Greek prose. His dialogues have influenced not only philosophers, but playwrights, poets, theologians, and political theorists. They were read in the original Greek for centuries in the Mediterranean world and became central texts in the curricula of European universities during the Renaissance. In modern American education, Plato's dialogues are standard reading in liberal arts colleges and philosophy departments. The Republic is often assigned in political theory courses, while Apology and Crito are used to discuss civil disobedience and moral duty. His literary method allows students, especially at the high school and undergraduate level, to enter complex philosophical questions through dialogue and character rather than dense abstraction. But beyond the classroom, Plato's writings continue to speak to a universal human concern. How should we live? What is justice? What is truth? By dramatizing these questions rather than answering them definitively, Plato invites each reader to join the conversation, a conversation that began more than 2,400 years ago and continues to shape the intellectual soul of Western civilization. 10. Theory of forms and metaphysics. At the heart of Plato's philosophy lies one of the most daring and influential ideas in Western thought, the theory of forms. This metaphysical framework, developed most fully in his middle and late dialogues, attempts to explain the nature of reality, knowledge, and the relationship between the material world and eternal truths. For Plato, the physical world is not the ultimate reality. It is a world of change, imperfection, and illusion. True reality exists in a separate, non-material realm composed of forms or ideas, perfect, immutable, and eternal entities that give structure and meaning to everything we perceive. Plato first introduces this concept in dialogues like Phaedo, Republic, and Symposium, and then challenges and refines it in works like Parmenides and Timaeus. The theory of forms offers a solution to problems that had troubled pre-Socratic philosophers. How can we have knowledge of things that are always changing? What accounts for the order and intelligibility of the universe? Why do we recognize beauty or justice even in imperfect examples? According to Plato, every object or quality in the material world participates in or imitates a corresponding form. For example, all beautiful things participate in the form of beauty, all just actions in the form of justice, and all equal objects in the form of equality. These forms are not mental constructs or abstractions. They exist objectively, outside of space and time. They are the true reality, whereas the material world is only a shadow or reflection. To illustrate this, Plato presents the allegory of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic. In this allegory, prisoners are chained in a cave, facing a wall on which shadows are cast by objects behind them, illuminated by fire. The prisoners believe these shadows are the only reality because they have never seen the real objects. If one prisoner escapes and sees the sunlit world outside, he realizes that what he took as reality was merely a pale imitation. When he returns to the cave to tell the others, they reject him, preferring the familiarity of shadows to the difficult truth. This allegory represents the philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge, from illusion to the contemplation of the forms, especially the highest form, the form of the good, which illuminates all others as the sun illuminates the world. The form of the good occupies the highest place in Plato's metaphysical hierarchy. It is the source of all truth, order, and intelligibility, comparable to the sun in the visible realm. Just as sunlight makes vision possible, the form of the good makes understanding possible. It is beyond being, beyond definition, and yet it is the cause of all existence and knowledge. Without it, Plato argues, nothing can be truly known or truly real. This metaphysical vision has several important implications. Epistemology. Knowledge must be of what is unchanging. Therefore, true knowledge, episteme, is about the forms, not about physical things, which are always in flux. What we gain through the senses is opinion, doxa, not knowledge. Ontology. There is a two-tiered reality, the world of becoming, the physical, sensory world, and the world of being, the eternal forms. The physical is dependent on the intelligible. The visible depends on the invisible. Ethics and politics. Since the forms are the standard for truth and goodness, the just person or the just society must align itself with these eternal realities. Philosophers, trained to grasp the forms through dialectic, are uniquely suited to rule. To explain how we come to know the forms, Plato proposes a doctrine of recollection, anamnesis, particularly in Meno and Phaedo. He suggests that the soul is immortal and has seen the forms before birth. What we call learning is actually the process of remembering truths that the soul once knew. This reinforces the idea that true knowledge is internal, intuitive, and rational, not derived from sensory experience. In Timaeus, Plato also explores a cosmological dimension to his metaphysics. He describes a divine craftsman, the demiurge, who uses the forms as templates to shape the cosmos out of pre-existing chaotic matter. The universe, though not perfect, reflects the order and beauty of the forms as much as physical material can. This introduces a divine element to Plato's system. The world is intelligible because it was created according to reason, not chance. In Parmenides, however, Plato offers a powerful critique of his own theory. Through a character representing the philosopher Parmenides, he poses difficult questions. How do the forms relate to one another? Do forms exist for every concept, even for negative or trivial things like hair or mud? Does participation mean similarity or something else? This dialogue shows Plato wrestling with the logical and metaphysical challenges of his own model, suggesting that he was not dogmatic but open to refinement and self-critique. From a modern American perspective, Plato's metaphysics may seem abstract, even mystical, but its influence can be seen across disciplines, from Christian theology's notion of divine perfection to Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, to mathematical Platonism, which holds that abstract numbers and structures exist independently of human thought. In U.S. universities, the theory of forms continues to be taught as a foundational concept in philosophy, metaphysics, and epistemology. More broadly, Plato's vision offers a challenge to relativism and materialism. In a culture saturated with change, image, and distraction, the theory of forms asserts that truth exists, unchanging, eternal, and knowable through reason. It argues that behind every appearance lies a deeper structure, a perfect model waiting to be understood. For Plato, to philosophize is to reach upward toward those realities, not to escape the world, but to see it clearly, illuminated by the light of what is truly real.
11. Politics and the ideal state. Plato's political philosophy, articulated most fully in the Republic and later revised in the Laws, remains one of the most influential and debated visions of governance in Western thought.
Deeply shaped by his experiences during the Peloponnesian War, the execution of Socrates, and his failed political intervention in Syracuse, Plato became convinced that only a radical rethinking of the structure of society could prevent injustice and moral collapse. At the core of his vision was a bold idea. The best society is one ruled by philosophers, individuals trained in reason, ethics, and truth who are uniquely capable of guiding the state toward justice. In the Republic, Plato constructs a model of the ideal city, Callipolis, as a mirror of the just soul. He argues that justice in the city can only be achieved when each class performs its proper function in harmony with the others. He divides the population into three main classes, corresponding to the three parts of the soul. Rulers, reason; the philosopher kings who govern with wisdom and pursue the common good. Guardians, or auxiliaries; spirit; the warrior class who defend the state and enforce the ruler's decisions. Producers, appetite; the majority of the population, including farmers, artisans, and merchants, who provide material needs. This tripartite model parallels Plato's vision of the soul. Reason should rule, supported by spirit, and keeping appetite in check. A just city, like a just soul, is ordered, balanced, and rationally governed. In this view, justice is not equality of outcomes or even of opportunity. It is a harmony in which each person fulfills the role to which they are best suited by nature and education. Plato's claim that philosophers should rule is perhaps his most controversial political proposition. He defines philosophers not as bookish intellectuals, but as those who love wisdom, have a deep understanding of the eternal forms, especially the form of the good, and are guided by reason rather than personal gain or public approval. These individuals, he argues, are least likely to abuse power because they do not seek it. Therefore, paradoxically, only those who do not desire to rule are fit to rule. To ensure that rulers are truly wise and virtuous, Plato advocates for a rigorous system of education and selection. Starting from childhood, potential leaders are trained in mathematics, music, physical education, and dialectic, with increasing levels of complexity and abstraction. By the time they reach age 50, after decades of testing and moral training, the most capable are chosen to govern. This system is designed to prevent corruption, short-term thinking, and demagoguery. Plato is sharply critical of democracy, as it existed in Athens. He sees it as a system where ignorant masses are manipulated by charismatic figures who appeal to emotion rather than reason. In the Republic, he likens democracy to a ship where the crew elects the captain not based on knowledge of navigation, but on who flatters them the most. The result, he argues, is disorder, poor leadership, and eventual tyranny. For Plato, democracy tends to devolve into mob rule, and the pursuit of freedom without discipline leads to societal decay. Likewise, tyranny, rule by a single leader who seizes power through fear and flattery, is for Plato the worst form of government. The tyrant is governed by irrational appetites and enslaves the population to satisfy personal desires. Plato views tyranny as the final stage in the degeneration of political systems, emerging from unchecked liberty and the collapse of moral order. In the Laws, a dialogue written in Plato's later years, he presents a more pragmatic political vision, recognizing that the ideal of philosopher kings may be unattainable. Instead of a perfectly rational state, the Laws proposes a mixed constitution, combining rule of law with carefully designed institutions to promote virtue among citizens. The dialogue focuses on legal codes, education, and religious observance as tools for shaping character. It also acknowledges the need for compromise and the complexity of human nature.
In both the Republic and the Laws, education is central. Plato sees it not as vocational training, but as the cultivation of the soul. A society can only be just if its citizens are taught to love truth, exercise reason, and live virtuously. This belief continues to influence modern liberal arts education, where moral and intellectual development are emphasized over purely technical skills. Plato's political thought has had a wide-ranging impact. Early Christian thinkers adopted elements of his hierarchical vision of society. Renaissance Republicans and Enlightenment philosophers wrestled with his critique of democracy. In the 20th century, some critics, like Karl Popper, accused Plato of laying the foundations for authoritarianism in the open society and its enemies. Others, such as Leo Strauss and Alan Bloom, argued that Plato offered a necessary correction to modern relativism and nihilism. In the American context, Plato's ideas appear both as inspiration and warning. The Founding Fathers, though steeped in Enlightenment liberalism, were aware of the dangers of mob rule and the need for a wise and virtuous leadership. Hence, the emphasis on representative government and constitutional checks. Plato's insistence on the moral and intellectual formation of leaders resonates with the U.S. ideal of the public servant, who governs not for personal gain, but for the common good. Yet Plato's model also challenges core American values. His rigid class divisions, censorship of art in the Republic, and skepticism toward individual liberty contrast sharply with democratic pluralism and free expression. His ideal city prioritizes harmony and virtue over choice and diversity, values that can clash with a modern liberal democracy. Nevertheless, Plato's vision remains a powerful thought experiment. It forces us to ask, what makes a good leader? How can a society cultivate justice? What role should education play in shaping public life? In answering these questions, Plato demands that we look beyond elections and policies and examine the deeper structure of the human soul, the nature of truth, and the responsibilities of power.
12. Ethics and the human soul. For Plato, ethics was inseparable from psychology. Moral behavior was not simply a matter of obeying rules or customs. It was about the proper ordering of the soul. In his philosophy, the individual soul and the ideal city reflect the same structure, and just as justice in the state requires harmony between its classes, justice in the person depends on balance between the parts of the soul. Plato's ethical thought, developed primarily in the Republic, Phaedrus and Gorgias, centers on the tripartite theory of the soul, the pursuit of virtue, arete, and the concept of the good as the highest object of knowledge and aspiration. Plato divides the soul into three distinct parts. Rational, logistikon, the part that seeks truth, wisdom, and long-term understanding. It is the governing faculty in a well-ordered soul. Spirited, divoides, the source of courage, honor, and ambition. It supports the rational part when properly trained. Appetitive, epithetikon, the part concerned with desires, pleasures, and material needs. It is necessary, but must be controlled. In the ethical life, virtue is harmony among these three parts, with reason ruling, spirit aligning with reason's judgments, and appetite being moderated. In the same way that the ideal city has philosopher kings, auxiliaries, and producers working together for justice, the virtuous soul is structured according to rational control, moral courage, and disciplined desire. Each part of the soul has its corresponding virtue: rational to wisdom, spirited to courage, appetitive to temperance, altogether to justice. Justice in this model is not merely fairness in external actions. It is inner balance, the condition of a soul performing its proper function. Injustice, by contrast, is disorder, when desires overpower reason or when emotions dominate judgment. This ethical framework emphasizes self-mastery as the key to moral goodness. Plato's ethical ideal is deeply intellectualist. To be good, one must know the good. Ignorance is the root of vice. Knowledge is the path to virtue. He does not believe that people knowingly choose evil. They act wrongly because they are confused about what is truly beneficial or pleasurable. Thus, moral education becomes essential, not just teaching habits, but training the soul to recognize and pursue real goods, not illusions. In dialogues like Gorgias, Plato contrasts true happiness with the pursuit of immediate gratification. He argues that tyrants, although powerful and indulgent, are not happy. They're enslaved by their desires, living in constant fear and disorder. The person who disciplines the soul and lives according to reason, even if poor or persecuted, is ultimately more fulfilled. This argument culminates in Republic Book 9, where Plato presents a vivid image of the soul's tyranny, internally fractured, irrational, and miserable, versus the soul of the philosopher, serene and whole. Education, therefore, is not about putting knowledge into the soul, but turning the soul toward what is already there. In the Republic, Plato likens the process of ethical development to turning the eye of the soul toward the light. This metaphor extends the allegory of the cave. Ethical enlightenment involves a painful but rewarding reorientation away from shadows and toward truth. Teachers do not implant virtue. They help the soul recollect and focus on the good. In Phaedrus, Plato adds a poetic dimension to ethics through the charioteer metaphor. The soul is imagined as a chariot with two horses, one noble, spirit, and one base, appetite, guided by the charioteer, reason. The ethical life is a struggle to guide the chariot toward the divine realm, where the soul contemplates true beauty and goodness. Failure to control the horses leads to descent and fragmentation. Success leads to unity and ascent. The ultimate aim of ethical life for Plato is the vision of the good, a transcendent, ineffable reality beyond being that illuminates all other forms. In Republic Book 6, the good is likened to the sun. It makes knowledge possible and gives existence to all that is. To know the good is not merely to be moral, it is to be fully alive, attuned to the deepest order of reality. The philosopher, through dialectic, ascends toward this vision, and upon grasping it, seeks to return and help others. This orientation toward the good has deeply influenced religious and philosophical traditions in the West. In Christianity, the idea of a supreme, unchanging good becomes aligned with the nature of God. In modern ethics, Plato's insistence on internal harmony and self-knowledge continues to inform psychological and moral education. From a contemporary American lens, Plato's ethics challenge many cultural assumptions. In a society often focused on external success, consumer pleasure, or subjective preference, his framework insists that happiness comes not from wealth or freedom alone, but from inner discipline, moral clarity, and rational purpose. His ethics are not punitive, but aspirational. They ask, what kind of person do you want to become? Are you ruled by wisdom or by your impulses? In American educational institutions, particularly in liberal arts and classical schools, Plato's ethical system remains foundational. His writings are taught not merely for historical value, but as living texts. Texts that provoke students to question what it means to live a good life and how to align their character with truth and reason. Plato's ethics extend beyond the individual. He believed that just societies could only be built by just individuals, that the health of the state depends on the health of the soul. In that sense, his moral philosophy is inseparable from his political vision. Virtue is both a personal and civic responsibility, and philosophy is the path to both.
13. Plato and art, the controversial aesthetic. Plato's relationship with art, particularly poetry, painting, and drama, is one of the most debated aspects of his philosophy. Unlike his admiration for mathematics and dialectic, Plato expresses deep suspicion toward the arts, especially in The Republic and Ion. He sees them not as harmless entertainment, but as powerful forces that shape character, stir emotion, and distort truth.
For a philosopher committed to rational harmony and the pursuit of eternal forms, art's appeal to sensation and emotion posed both a philosophical and ethical threat. In the Republic, particularly in books 2, 3, and 10, Plato outlines his most systematic critique. He famously argues that most poetry, especially Homer and the tragic poets, should be excluded from the ideal city. This position seems paradoxical. Plato himself was a literary master, crafting dialogues filled with dramatic scenes, vivid myths, and emotionally powerful speeches. Yet, he maintained a clear distinction between philosophical poetry, which elevates the soul, and imitative poetry, which panders to the passions. Plato's primary concern is that art is imitation, mimesis, and not of reality but of appearance. According to his metaphysics, true reality is found in the world of forms. The physical world is already an imperfect copy of these forms. Art then becomes a copy of a copy, twice removed from the truth. A painting of a bed, for example, is not the form of a bed, nor even the physical bed. It is merely a visual reproduction of the physical object, lacking in substance or knowledge. This distance from truth, Plato argues, makes art dangerous. It does not educate, it seduces. Poets like Homer may depict heroes, gods, and moral dilemmas, but their representations are not grounded in philosophical reasoning. They arouse pity, fear, anger, and desire, bypassing the rational part of the soul and exciting the irrational elements. For Plato, this is ethically corrosive. In the ideal state, where the soul must be trained toward justice and reason, such emotional manipulation undermines the educational project. In addition to metaphysical and psychological concerns, Plato raises moral objections to the content of art. The epics and tragedies of his day often portrayed the gods as vengeful, jealous, or deceitful, qualities unworthy of divine beings. By representing the gods in immoral ways, these works teach falsehoods and confuse the public's understanding of virtue. Similarly, characters in plays often succeed through trickery or indulge in unchecked emotion, reinforcing vice rather than virtue. Plato's critique extends to music, which he believes has a direct effect on the soul's structure. In Republic, Book 3, he proposes strict censorship of musical modes and rhythms. Certain scales, like the Dorian and Phrygian, are said to promote courage and temperance, while others, like the Lydian or Ionian, promote softness or indulgence. Music, in his view, is not neutral. It shapes ethos, character. Therefore, only music that supports the soul's rational harmony should be permitted. Despite this strict stance, Plato does not reject all art. In Phaedrus and Symposium, he explores the role of divine madness, inspired states including poetic and artistic ecstasy that can lead the soul upward toward truth and beauty. Here he acknowledges that certain forms of artistic inspiration, when guided by philosophy, can reveal glimpses of the eternal. The myths he includes in many of his dialogues, such as the myth of the chariot allegory, and the myth of the cave, demonstrate his own mastery of storytelling as a pedagogical tool. This suggests that Plato's real issue is not with art itself, but with unexamined art, art that bypasses reason, reinforces false beliefs, or distracts from the pursuit of the good. He wants art to be in the service of truth, not spectacle. In a well-ordered soul or city, aesthetics must align with ethics and metaphysics. From an American perspective, Plato's critique of art has deep relevance in debates over media, entertainment, and culture. His concerns about art's power to influence behavior, distort truth, and inflame emotion echo in current discussions about violent films, propaganda, advertising, and social media algorithms. Just as Plato warned against the glamorization of vice in Homeric epics, critics today question the effects of glamorized violence, hypersexualization, and algorithmic echo chambers on public morality and mental health. Yet many modern thinkers have pushed back against Plato's suspicion of art. Aristotle, his own student, famously defended tragedy in Poetics, arguing that it has a cathartic function, purging emotions in a healthy way. In the Enlightenment and Romantic periods, artists were celebrated as visionaries, and art was seen as a vehicle for moral and spiritual elevation, not distortion. For many, Plato's call to censor or control art represents an overreach, an authoritarian impulse that underestimates the audience's ability to interpret and reflect critically. In American educational settings, Plato's views often provoke lively discussion. Should public art serve a moral function? Should entertainment be regulated to promote social values? What responsibilities do artists have to truth or virtue? These questions, rooted in Plato's Republic, remain urgent today. Ultimately, Plato's controversial stance on art reveals his deep seriousness about the moral life. He believed that everything in society, education, politics, language, and culture, must serve the cultivation of the just soul. Art was not exempt. In a world where images, sounds, and stories can shape entire generations, his insistence on the ethical power of aesthetics remains as challenging as it is enduring.
14. Scientific interests and natural philosophy. While Plato is best known for his contributions to ethics, metaphysics, and political theory, his engagement with science, particularly mathematics, astronomy, cosmology, and natural philosophy, was equally profound. He believed that the physical universe, though an imperfect copy of the eternal world of forms, could still be understood through rational principles and mathematical order. For Plato, science was not a separate discipline from philosophy. It was a crucial step on the soul's journey toward truth, providing the intellectual rigor needed to ascend from the visible to the intelligible. Plato's most explicit scientific account appears in the dialogue Timaeus, where he presents a cosmological narrative that seeks to explain the origin, structure, and harmony of the universe. In it, he introduces the concept of the demiurge, a divine craftsman who imposes rational order on pre-existing chaotic matter, using the eternal forms as templates. The result is a cosmos that, while not perfect, like the realm of forms, is as good and ordered as material reality can be. The universe, according to Timaeus, is a living creature, infused with a world soul, governed by proportion, symmetry, and mathematical law. Central to Plato's scientific worldview was his belief that mathematics reveals the hidden structure of reality. He held mathematics in such high regard that above the entrance to the academy was reportedly inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." For Plato, numbers, ratios, and geometric forms were not just tools for practical calculation, they were reflections of eternal truth. He saw geometry as a bridge between the physical and intelligible worlds, allowing the philosopher to grasp the abstract forms behind the mutable surface of things. In Republic, Book 7, Plato outlines a curriculum for future rulers in which mathematical disciplines are essential. He lists arithmetic, geometry, solid geometry, astronomy, and harmony, music theory, as preparatory studies before engaging in dialectic. Each of these subjects, he argues, turns the soul away from the sensory world and toward the realm of eternal, unchanging truths. The ability to think abstractly, to recognize order, to follow a logical system, all of this, for Plato, was part of becoming a philosopher and, by extension, a just ruler. Plato's approach to astronomy is especially telling. Unlike practical stargazers or astrologers who studied the sky for prediction or navigation, Plato wanted to understand the mathematical patterns underlying the heavens. He insisted that celestial movements must follow rational principles. In Timaeus, he describes the orbits of the planets and stars as perfect circles, because circular motion, being regular and unending, reflects the perfection of the divine order. Though this idea would later prove incorrect in its specifics, it laid the philosophical foundation for the Ptolemaic and ultimately Copernican revolution centuries later.
Plato's scientific interests also intersected with Pythagorean thought, especially in his fascination with numerical relationships and musical harmony. He believed that the universe was governed by ratios, and that the same proportions governing musical intervals also structured the cosmos. This idea of a music of the spheres, a celestial harmony created by the movement of heavenly bodies, became a major influence in both medieval cosmology and Renaissance science. Plato was not, however, a scientist in the modern empirical sense. He did not conduct experiments or rely on observation as the primary source of knowledge. In fact, he was somewhat skeptical of empirical data, viewing the senses as unreliable and the visible world as deceptive. His approach to science was rationalist. He believed that the true nature of things could only be grasped through abstract reasoning and logical deduction, not by observation alone. This distinction placed Plato in contrast with his student Aristotle, who emphasized empirical investigation and developed systematic classifications of plants, animals, and physical phenomena. While Plato sought eternal truths in the heavens and in numbers, Aristotle found them in the natural world through careful observation. The tension between these two approaches, rationalism and empiricism, would define the trajectory of science for millennia. From an American educational perspective, Plato's influence can be seen in the liberal arts model, which values mathematics and science not only for technical skill, but as tools for intellectual development. In classical schools and honors colleges across the United States, students still study Euclidean geometry, Pythagorean harmonics, and Platonic cosmology as part of the broader pursuit of truth. More broadly, Plato's insistence on order, harmony, and intelligibility in the natural world continues to shape the modern scientific imagination. The belief that the universe is not random, but structured and rational, and that it can be understood through mathematics, is a Platonic legacy. Modern physics, with its search for elegant, unified laws governing space, time, and matter, echoes Plato's dream of a cosmos governed by the logic of the forms. Critics may note that Plato's rejection of empirical methods limited his scientific contributions, but his philosophical framing of science as a quest for eternal order helped give birth to scientific thinking as a noble and necessary pursuit. In a time when many cultures treated nature as chaotic, hostile, or arbitrary, Plato dared to assert that the universe was not only comprehensible, but beautiful. His influence on figures like Kepler, Galileo, and Newton, as well as Einstein, who famously said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, shows how deeply Plato's vision of an ordered cosmos still resonates. In Plato's view, the study of nature was not a distraction from the good life, it was a path toward it. For the soul to ascend, it must first learn to see the world not as chaos, but as cosmos, a universe of structure, beauty, and meaning, crafted by reason and accessible through thought.
15. Influence on Aristotle and the split in thought. One of the most consequential relationships in the history of philosophy was that between Plato and his student Aristotle. For 20 years, Aristotle studied at Plato's academy in Athens, arriving around 367 BCE as a teenager, and remaining until Plato's death in 347 BCE. During that time, Aristotle absorbed the full scope of Plato's philosophical system, its metaphysics, ethics, politics, cosmology, and epistemology. But he would eventually come to challenge and diverge from many of Plato's core ideas, creating a new philosophical path that would rival, and in some cases replace, the Platonic tradition in the centuries to come. The intellectual bond between teacher and student was profound. Plato recognized Aristotle's brilliance early on, reportedly referring to him as the mind of the academy. Aristotle, in turn, referred to Plato as the master, and acknowledged the foundational role his teacher played in shaping his thinking. Yet from the beginning, Aristotle was more empirically inclined.
Where Plato looked to eternal, non-material forms for the essence of things, Aristotle turned to the observable world and the study of nature. This distinction would come to define the central split in Western philosophy between rationalism, Plato, and empiricism, Aristotle. The theory of forms was the first major point of contention. While Plato believed that every material object participates in a perfect, non-physical form that exists outside of time and space, Aristotle rejected this dualism. He argued that form exists within the object itself, not in a separate realm. In his view, the substance of a thing is composed of both matter and form, inseparably united. For example, a tree's treeness is not a separate, abstract ideal, but the essential organization of its matter into a living organism. Aristotle also diverged sharply on epistemology, or the nature of knowledge. Plato held that true knowledge comes from rational recollection of the forms, and that the senses are unreliable. Aristotle, by contrast, insisted that knowledge begins with sensory experience, which the mind then organizes through reason. He emphasized inductive reasoning, systematic classification, and empirical observation. Where Plato was concerned with what is eternally true, Aristotle sought to understand what is universally observable. In ethics, too, their differences were significant. Plato saw virtue as the harmony of the soul's parts and the alignment with eternal forms, especially the form of the good. Aristotle developed a more practical, character-based ethic centered on the concept of eudaimonia, flourishing or well-being. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argued that the good life is achieved by practicing virtue in moderation, cultivating habits of excellence, and living in accordance with reason within a social context. His ethics focused less on metaphysical perfection and more on the realistic conditions of human life. Their political theories also diverged. Plato imagined an ideal republic ruled by philosopher kings with a rigid class structure and communal property among the elite. Aristotle took a more empirical and comparative approach, studying real constitutions and identifying different forms of government, such as monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, a mixed constitution. While he agreed that virtue was central to good governance, he believed that the best government depends on the character of the citizens and the stability of the state. Aristotle's politics is thus more grounded and flexible than Plato's utopian vision. Despite their disagreements, Aristotle did not reject Plato wholesale. He built on many Platonic ideas, such as the importance of education, the centrality of reason, and the pursuit of the good. His critiques were respectful and measured, reflecting a genuine attempt to refine and complete what Plato had begun. Theirs was not a personal rupture, but a philosophical evolution, a handing of the baton from one kind of thinker to another. The impact of their divergence is monumental. The tension between Platonic idealism and Aristotelian realism would echo through Christian theology, Islamic philosophy, medieval scholasticism, Enlightenment thought, and modern science. In the early Christian tradition, Augustine leaned heavily on Plato, integrating the theory of forms into a theology of divine perfection. Later, Thomas Aquinas would synthesize Aristotle's empirical method with Christian doctrine, creating a powerful new model for understanding faith and reason. During the Renaissance, Platonic thought experienced a revival through Marsilio Ficino and the Florentine Academy, while the scientific revolution embraced many Aristotelian principles of logic and natural observation, even as it later moved beyond them. In the Enlightenment, philosophers like Kant attempted to reconcile the two traditions, arguing that while knowledge begins with experience, as Aristotle believed, it is shaped by innate structures of reason, a Platonic idea. In American universities, the Platonic-Aristotelian split is still felt. Courses in political theory often begin with the Republic and politics. Ethics classes contrast the transcendental idealism of Plato with the virtue ethics of Aristotle. Even in science, the debate persists between theoretical modeling, Platonic, and experimental validation, Aristotelian. Culturally, Plato appeals to those who seek eternal meaning, ideal justice, and the transformative power of education. Aristotle appeals to those who value practical wisdom, empirical inquiry, and adaptation to circumstance. In this sense, they represent two complementary sides of the philosophical endeavor. Plato, the dreamer and system builder; Aristotle, the analyst and classifier. Yet perhaps their greatest contribution is that they set the terms for the very nature of philosophy itself, its questions, its methods, its role in public life. By challenging his teacher, Aristotle did not diminish Plato's legacy. He expanded it, and in doing so, he ensured that the philosophical conversation begun at the academy would never end, but evolve with every generation of thinkers who dare to ask, what is real? What is true? What is just?
16. Final years at the Academy. Plato's final years were spent at the Academy, the institution he founded decades earlier that had grown into the preeminent center of learning in the Greek world. By the time of his old age, he was no longer merely a teacher or philosopher. He had become a living symbol of the philosophical life. As the head of the Academy, he presided over an intellectual community that included mathematicians, astronomers, ethicists, political theorists, and students from across the Greek-speaking world. The Academy had matured into a stable institution, with a lasting curriculum shaping generations of minds and establishing a model that would influence education for centuries. Unlike many thinkers who fade into retirement, Plato remained intellectually active well into his 70s and 80s. He continued to write, teach, and engage in discussion, refining his philosophical views and responding to the criticisms raised by both allies and skeptics. Some of his most complex and speculative works, Timaeus, Critias, Parmenides, Philebus, and Laws, are believed to have been written during this period, suggesting that his intellectual curiosity and creative energy never waned. In these late dialogues, Plato confronted many of the limitations and unresolved tensions in his earlier thought. In Parmenides, for example, he staged a powerful critique of his own theory of forms, acknowledging the logical difficulties in explaining how immaterial forms interact with the physical world. Rather than retreat from these challenges, he explored them rigorously, demonstrating a philosopher's commitment to truth even when it required rethinking his own assumptions. In Philebus, Plato examined the nature of pleasure, intellect, and the good life, presenting a more nuanced view of ethics that balances rationality with human experience. And in Laws, his final and most extensive dialogue, he presented a pragmatic vision of governance that departed from the utopian idealism of the Republic. Recognizing that the philosopher king was unlikely to emerge in the real world, Plato outlined a second-best constitution, one grounded in the rule of law, civic education, and religious observance. This shift from utopian idealism to grounded reform reflects not only Plato's aging wisdom, but also his ongoing engagement with the political realities of the Greek world. He had witnessed tyranny, civil war, the execution of Socrates, and the volatility of democracy. In his final years, he sought not just to imagine a perfect society, but to influence real cities and lawmakers, even if imperfectly. Laws represents his attempt to articulate a viable path to where justice, order, and virtue in the world as it actually is. Within the Academy, Plato remained a revered figure. His students, including Speusippus, his nephew and eventual successor, Xenocrates, and others, carried on his methods and ideas. The school developed its own identity, blending mathematical study with metaphysical speculation and public ethics. Though Aristotle had departed to found his own institution, the Lyceum, the Academy retained its prestige and philosophical mission, focused on dialectical inquiry and the search for eternal truths. Plato's death is believed to have occurred around 347 BCE, likely in his early 80s. Ancient sources differ in details, but one traditional account holds that he died peacefully in his sleep during a wedding feast. This serene image of a philosopher departing life while surrounded by community and celebration has symbolic power. It reflects the ideal he so often described, a life ordered by reason, elevated by virtue, and devoted to the pursuit of the good. Even in death, Plato's influence did not fade. The Academy continued for centuries, inspiring countless thinkers and shaping the intellectual foundations of Hellenistic philosophy, Roman education, and later Christian theology. His dialogues were preserved, studied, and translated by scholars across the Mediterranean. In Alexandria, Byzantium, and later Renaissance Europe, Plato's works were treated not just as ancient texts, but as living sources of wisdom. In the American intellectual tradition, Plato remains a central figure. His name appears on the syllabi of high schools, liberal arts colleges, and law schools across the country. His dialogues are staged in classrooms and quoted in political speeches. The structure of U.S. government, based on reason, checks and balances, and public virtue, owes an indirect debt to the philosophical ideals he developed. The idea that education should shape the moral character of citizens, that reason should guide public life, and that justice must be pursued, even when unpopular, these are Platonic values that continued to animate democratic life. Plato's final years at the Academy, then, were not a retreat from the world, but a culmination of his lifelong project. He had set out to redeem philosophy after the execution of Socrates. He ended by building a philosophical institution that outlived empires and reshaped civilizations. His death marked the end of a singular life, but not of his influence. To read Plato is to enter a conversation that has never ended, a conversation about truth, justice, beauty, love, power, and the soul. In this sense, his final years were not a conclusion, but a legacy in motion, a living testament to the power of ideas to outlast time.